Welcome to another quiet journey into the distant past. Tonight we drift slowly through the dusty heat and distant clamor of one of the world's first true cities, Babylon, a place of grandeur and grit, bureaucracy and belief, invention and inequality. Beneath the towering ziggurats and solemn temples, ordinary people lived and labored under the weight of tradition, duty, and a rising empire that promised both order and oppression. This is not the Babylon of legend and magic, but the Babylon of aching backs, clay-stained hands and debts that chained families for generations. As the waters of the Euphrates curled through baked streets and alleyways, life pulsed with noise, labor, and ancient rhythm. Here, the past was written in hardened clay, and the future was often unforgiving. Over the next 2 hours, we will walk these sun-baked paths together. We will meet a lowly brickmaker whose life was measured by the kiln's fire and the overseer's glare. We will watch as Hammurabi, a cunning ruler and cold tactician, uses lore and legend to bind a scattered land. We will climb, quietly, into the mysteries of the ziggurat, those sacred towers whose meanings may still elude us. And finally, we will sit in shaded splendor beside the city's priests, bearded, perfumed, and powerful, who lived lives quite unlike those of the workers they ruled over. So close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let yourself drift. You are entering Babylon, not as a god or a king, but as a worker of mud and sweat, whose every breath is counted, and whose life, like so many others, is written not in ink, but in the dust of the earth. Let us begin. The sun hasn't yet risen, but already the heat presses faintly at your skin, a warning of what's to come. The air smells of damp soil and something slightly sour, fermenting grain maybe, or the lingering staleness of last night's cooking fires. Your mat is made of reeds, uneven and coarse beneath your shoulder. You slept badly again. Your name is not important because there are thousands like you. You are a brickmaker in Babylon, one of the many who take the mud from the riverbanks and shape it into the bones of this growing city. The river has always been your master. The Euphrates giveth, and it taketh away. In flood season, it drowns fields and homes. In the dry months, it recedes just enough to offer thick, silty clay, sticky and heavy in the hand. This is your clay. This is your burden. You rise before the first call of the temple horn, already sore. There's little to eat, some dried bread, left too long near the hearth, and a swallow of weak beer, sour and flat. It settles uneasily in your stomach, but you swallow anyway. You cannot work on an empty belly. Outside, the streets are still shadows and whispers. Dogs skulk near broken walls, their ribs sharp beneath patchy fur. A child cries somewhere briefly and is hushed. You step into the alley, clay-dusted feet already darkening as you make your way toward the pit. Your gang is small. 5 men, all thin, all tired. One has a bad back, another a cough that never leaves. No one speaks much. Words are saved for commands or complaints. The foreman is not here yet, which means the day hasn't officially started. But you know better than to waste time. You kneel by the pit's edge and plunge your arms into the slick brown mass. It sucks at your skin, grainy, cold, alive almost with tiny rocks and tangled roots. You scoop and lift again and again, dropping the heavy mud into wooden molds. Each mold must be filled, smoothed, and set aside to dry. Too slow, and you fall behind. Too fast, and the bricks crack in the sun. Either way, you'll be punished. There are quotas. Of course there are. Babylon is a city that records everything. How much you make, how many bricks are rejected, how many days you've missed. The overseer keeps a tablet. He does not forget. The sun rises higher now, glaring down through a haze of yellow dust. Sweat stings your eyes. The mud darkens your fingernails, dries on your arms like plaster. Your back aches. Your feet slip in the sludge. There is no pause. Only when the horn sounds for midday, long and mournful, do you stop. You sit beneath the shade of a leaning wall, sipping from a shared jug of water that tastes faintly of clay. You eat a bit more bread and chew it slowly. Around you, the city breathes. Somewhere drums are playing, somewhere a scribe dips his stylus into wet clay. But here, there is only the sound of flies, of men coughing, and the dull slap of fresh bricks dropping to the ground. Your life is one of repetition: mud, mold, sun, sleep. There is no end in sight. You are not a free man, not really. Your family owes a debt. Your labor repays it little by little. If you falter, your wife may take your place, or your son. The day isn't over. It never really ends here in Babylon. But for now, you rest. And the mud waits. The break is brief. Soon, the foreman's voice echoes over the yard, a low bark always edged with irritation. His tunic is cleaner than yours. He carries a stylus tucked into a leather cord at his waist, and his eyes are sharp, always counting. He points at the line of drying bricks and mutters something about cracking, about carelessness. You bow your head and say nothing. Words can be dangerous. The midday sun is harsh now. It seems to press down on your shoulders like a physical weight. Babylon is quiet in this hour, except for the yards and workshops. Here, the world hums with effort. The kilns smolder on the edge of the brick field, dark mouths exhaling smoke into the pale sky. You hate the kilns, everyone does. They are enormous, round, and always hungry. Built of the very bricks you've shaped, they rise like stunted towers, each one blackened by years of fire. They radiate heat even before you light them. Inside, the air is thick, almost solid. You load them carefully, row after row, stacking each brick with painful precision. It's hard to breathe inside the kiln's chamber. The smoke clings to your lungs, to your hair, to the inside of your mouth. You've known men who fainted from the heat. One died last summer. No one speaks of him now. A replacement was found by the next morning. Once the kiln is full, the fire is fed. Wood, dried dung, anything that will burn. The foreman watches this part closely. The firing must be even, hot enough to harden the bricks, but not so hot that they warp. You are not trusted with the fire. That task belongs to the fire master, an older man with burn scars along his arms and a single clouded eye. He mutters to the flames as if they're old friends. You stand back, panting, covered in soot. Your tunic sticks to your skin. Every inch of your body aches. Still, there is more to do. Once the firing begins, you return to the pit to make more bricks. The cycle never ends. The Euphrates continues to give you clay. The sun continues to burn your skin. The overseer continues to count. It's during these long hours that you forget your own name. You become motion. You become rhythm, scoop, slap, smooth. The work silences you. It robs you of thought, but also of fear. In the quiet between movements, you feel something close to peace. Not comfort, never that, but something steady, something that does not change. By late afternoon, the air is filled with smoke. Your throat stings. Your arms tremble with fatigue. You hear the distant ringing of temple bells. Perhaps a festival is beginning, or a ceremony. You will not be invited. Such things are not for people like you. The foreman marks the tally in his tablet. 143 bricks. Not enough. Never enough. You bow again, say nothing, and return to the mud. Evening approaches slowly as the golden sun lowers behind the dusty outlines of rooftops and ziggurats. The light softens, but the air remains thick and warm, clinging to your skin like a second layer. There is no breeze. You walk home alone, your feet heavy, your hands sore and stained. Bits of dried mud cling beneath your nails, and your legs itch from the heat. Along the street you pass others returning from their own toil, fishermen, millers, potters. None look up. Each wears the same expression, weary, wary, resigned. Your dwelling is little more than a square of packed earth with walls of uneven brick, some cracked, some beginning to crumble. The roof is reed and thatch, patched with strips of old cloth. Inside, your wife tends a pot over the fire. It smells of onions and lentils, thin and watery. Your son sits in the corner, using a stick to draw shapes in the dust. His tunic is too small now, but you haven't had the means to replace it. You sit in silence. The food is passed around in rough bowls, eaten quickly, without ceremony. Your wife glances at your hands, says nothing, but presses a damp cloth into your palm. It is her way of tending to you, quiet, practical, wordless. Later, by the light of a small oil lamp, you take out the tablet. Not a holy tablet, not one of learning or praise. This one is yours, a debt ledger, brittle and sharp at the edges. You run your fingers over the cuneiform. You cannot read it, not truly, but you know what it means. The priest recorded it himself, years ago. A loan for grain during a poor harvest. Another to pay the burial fee for your father. One to buy a donkey that later died of a broken leg. The interest grows like vines in the dark. Each missed payment was marked, pressed into the clay, with a stylus that showed no mercy. Now the debt is unpayable. You are not free. Your wife is not free. And if nothing changes, your son will inherit it. You remember hearing stories, how some families sent children to temples as workers, as offerings, to erase their burdens. Others sold themselves to wealthy households as contract laborers. A few fled into the desert only to starve or vanish. But you make bricks, because Babylon needs bricks, always more bricks. The temples grow, the walls must be repaired. New homes are built for scribes, merchants, and officials. You are the invisible foundation beneath them all. Sometimes, in the hush of evening, you dream of the river, of walking into it and letting it carry you away. But the Euphrates is no escape. It is where your clay comes from. It is the beginning of your work. It is the reason you are bound. So instead, you sleep. Not soundly, not deeply, but enough. Tomorrow, the sun will rise again, and the debt will wait, still warm in the clay. Morning returns, slow and grey beneath a thin shroud of mist rising from the river. You are up before the birds, your joints stiff, your arms already aching with memory. The day begins, as they always do, washing your hands in a cracked basin, chewing stale bread, and listening to the low, distant murmur of the city as it stirs awake. But today, something is different. At the yard, the overseer is not alone. A man in fine linen with a seal ring on his finger and sandals too clean for the mud stands beside him. He carries a scroll and a clay tablet wrapped in cloth. His face is unreadable, smooth like the polished lapis stone the priests wear. Your gang lines up silently. The overseer calls names. He reads slowly, carefully, each syllable a hammer fall. When your name is called, your stomach knots. You step forward, head lowered. The man in linen opens the scroll. He reads aloud, not to you, but to the others. It's a record of quotas, a tally of missed bricks, days late, deductions. And then, finally, the line you feared most: default on a temple debt. There's no argument, no appeal. He produces a seal and a lump of fresh clay, presses it firmly. Then he nods. The meaning is clear. You have been transferred. Your debt, long unpayable, has been sold. Not forgiven, not erased, only moved, shifted from the temple's tablet to that of a private estate. You are now owned by a merchant, a builder of canals and roads. It means more bricks, longer hours, fewer rations, less oversight. And if you fail there, you may be sent farther down still. You do not cry, you do not beg. That would shame your family, and there is no space for shame here. Only the seal, only the clay, only the knowledge that your labor, your life, has changed hands with the press of a thumb. You are given 1 hour to return home, to gather your things, to say goodbye. Your wife stands still, lips parted but silent. She expected this, everyone did. The child clings to your leg, and you place a hand on his head gently. He doesn't yet understand. He will. You carry with you only what you can: your tools, your tunic, your sandals. The debt tablet is left behind. Its meaning has passed to someone else. As you leave, the sun breaks through the haze. The city looks golden, almost beautiful in the morning light. You walk slowly, already imagining the feel of new clay, the heat of a different kiln. In Babylon, nothing truly ends. It is only passed on, brick by brick, hand to hand, name to name, pressed forever into the clay. Long before his name was etched into stone, before the tall stele bore his image beside the seated god Shamash, Hammurabi ruled a land that was anything but unified. Babylon, in his early years, was not an empire. It was one small city-state among many, nestled between the chaotic pulse of the Tigris and Euphrates. To the north, the Assyrians watched from the mountains. To the south, the rival cities of Isin, Larsa, and Ur each competed for trade, territory, and tribute. And within Babylon's own walls, factions simmered. Priesthoods with their own loyalties, merchant guilds wary of royal interference, and clans whose alliances were as fragile as dried papyrus. Hammurabi inherited this brittle world from his father, Sin-Muballit, who had ruled cautiously, preferring diplomacy over war. The transition of power was quiet, but the challenges waiting for Hammurabi were not. His city was growing, but slowly, hemmed in by stronger rivals and plagued by internal squabbles. The irrigation canals needed maintenance, the temples demanded silver, and the granaries were never quite full enough. At just 35 years old, Hammurabi was untested. His court was small, his army limited, and his treasury strained by the debts of his predecessor. But he was observant. He listened, he watched. And he understood something that many before him had not. Control did not begin with conquest. It began with law, not just rules shouted in markets or dictated by priests, but laws set in stone, laws that were known, repeated, and unchangeable. Babylon was a city of scribes, and Hammurabi would speak to them in the language they trusted most, the written word. And yet, writing laws alone would not be enough. To shape an empire, Hammurabi would also need patience, alliances, and, when the time came, war. But he would not march in as a tyrant. He would arrive again and again as a liberator, a bringer of justice, a ruler chosen not just by men, but by the gods themselves. And so, in the quiet early years of his reign, while other kings measured power by their chariots or their gold, Hammurabi built something slower, sturdier, like the very bricks of Babylon. He built trust. He reshaped courts, replaced corrupt judges, and sent envoys to cities far beyond his borders. He wrote letters in careful cuneiform, negotiating border disputes, offering treaties, hinting at alliances. And all the while, he gathered strength. His spies traveled the river routes, noting troop movements, grain stores, and loyalties. His scribes began drafting codes, not yet laws, but thoughts, frameworks, ways of seeing justice that were consistent, not arbitrary. And as these pieces fell quietly into place, the kingdom of dust and division began to shift. People listened, priests nodded, rival kings grew nervous. Because Hammurabi was not loud, but he was deliberate. Every word was measured, every promise made with a purpose. And as Babylon's walls were repaired and her storehouses refilled, a rumor began to ripple outward that perhaps the gods had favored this quiet man, and that something larger was coming, something more than a city. A vision of unity, built not with the sword, but with the stylus. The year was dusty and long. Famine had touched the southern cities, grain shipments were light, there were murmurs of bandits near the border canals. Yet amid this unease, Hammurabi stood before his scribes and priests and unveiled what would become his most lasting legacy, a great stele, carved with cuneiform, taller than a man and shaped like a thumb pointing to the heavens. At the top of the stone, the god Shamash, the god of justice and sunlight, was carved seated, robed in layered folds, rays rising from his shoulders. Hammurabi, bareheaded and humble, stood before him, one hand raised in reverence. Beneath that image, line after line of text began, hundreds of lines, meticulously etched, meant to last forever. This was not the first law code in Mesopotamia, but it was different. It was complete. It covered the farmer and the merchant, the builder and the bride, the thief and the judge. It offered specific consequences, measured punishments, and a vision of order that reached across the social ladder, not equal but orderly, not fair in our modern sense, but consistent. Hammurabi made certain that it was not hidden in a temple or stored in a palace. It was placed in public, where all who could read or listen could know the law. And this was its real power. Because while some kings ruled by fear and others by inheritance, Hammurabi ruled by definition. By creating a framework where transgression had shape and justice had form, he positioned himself not just as a ruler, but as the living embodiment of fairness. But there was still the sword, for even the fairest law must be enforced. With his base secure and his image burnished by divine favor, Hammurabi moved to solidify his rule. The city of Larsa, long a thorn in Babylon's side, had grown weak. Its old king was gone, and the new one, Rimsin II, was already contending with unrest. Hammurabi sent messages, carefully phrased, offers of peace, demands for restitution. Then, when the replies came sharp and dismissive, he acted. The army he led was small, but it was disciplined. And the loyalty he had spent years cultivating paid off. Cities along the way opened their gates. Soldiers switched sides. By the time Hammurabi reached the walls of Larsa, the battle was already half won. When Larsa fell, Babylon's reach doubled overnight. Its trade routes expanded. Its storehouses were filled with grain and tribute. And most importantly, the law code carved onto the stele now applied to thousands more people. Other city-states began to take notice. Hammurabi continued, not in conquest alone, but in message. Each victory was framed not as domination, but as liberation. He was not subjugating rival kings, he claimed. He was restoring justice, enforcing the will of the gods, protecting the innocent from corruption. And because his victories were swift and his laws orderly, many believed him. He became not just a king, but a force. His name was spoken in river markets and courtrooms alike. And everywhere his rule reached, the same dark stone stele was set into place, etched, unchanging, a reminder that Babylon now stood at the center of something larger, an empire of laws, built not only on brick and bronze, but on the dangerous promise that order could last forever. As Hammurabi's empire swelled, so too did the challenges hiding within its walls. Laws, no matter how many were etched in stone, did not always behave as intended. For every decree about property or marriage, there were exceptions, loopholes, quiet manipulations by those who understood the spaces between words. And so justice, though publicly proclaimed and carved for all to see, was often whispered in the dark. Take, for example, the scribes. Trained from childhood, their mastery of cuneiform gave them immense control over how laws were interpreted and enforced. They could alter a single wedge in a tablet and shift the outcome of a dispute. They were called to witness sales, dowries, and contracts, and in doing so, became silent judges. Not divine like Shamash, not kingly like Hammurabi, but vital, and at times fallible. In the cities far from Babylon's heart, a stele might be present, but its words depended on who read them and who paid them. Corruption was not new in Mesopotamia, nor was injustice. Hammurabi knew this, which is why many of his laws spoke directly to those with power. The landlord who overcharged rent, the builder whose collapsing wall killed a tenant, the judge who issued false rulings. Each offense had a punishment. Some were harsh. A lying judge could be permanently removed and fined. A cheating merchant might lose a hand, But punishment required proof, witnesses, testimony, and here, too, the real world crept in. A poor farmer might accuse a wealthy landowner of theft, but would he dare bring it to court, knowing the landowner had ties to the temple, that he dined with the governor, that the scribe who would write the claim owed him silver? Justice, for all its divine framing, was a system woven into the fabric of society, and that fabric was uneven. Still, Hammurabi pushed forward. He sent judges out to the provinces. He demanded updates from governors. He built temples and encouraged priests to speak of justice from the pulpit. He created a culture where law was expected to be known, not just by nobles, but by shepherds and fishermen. He made education a political tool, a way to bind the people together beneath a shared understanding of order. But he also kept close to his military. For when the law failed, the soldiers did not. Rebellions flared in the west. Old allies grew restless. Assyria watched from afar, unsure whether to join or resist. And Hammurabi, aging but resolute, returned to the field, not always with his body, but always with his will. He sent generals bearing tablets. He reminded cities that the law had a backbone of bronze, and if they resisted, he responded with swift sieges, carefully calculated punishments, and then, again, the stele. It was always the same: conquest, then codification, violence followed by law. Not because he loved war, but because he understood something few others did, that the law, to endure, must be made visible not just in peace, but in the consequences of disobedience, in the darkness of a jail cell, in the silence after a judgment, in the hard, cold tablet buried in the archives of every conquered city. And so Babylon thrived, not through mercy, not through cruelty, but through a relentless insistence that justice, however flawed, must be preserved, even in the shadows. The twilight years of Hammurabi's reign arrived quietly, draped in the dust and golden haze of a kingdom now vast, tired, and orderly. He had ruled for more than 4 decades. His beard, once dark and trimmed with pride, was now streaked with silver. His voice, still measured and steady, echoed less in the war room and more in the council chambers, where scribes bent low to capture his final decisions. Babylon, by then, was no longer just a city. It was a model, copied, feared, studied. Its canals were well maintained. Its trade routes stretched far into the north and east. Its temples bustled with worship and whispers. And at the center of it all stood the man who had drawn the boundaries of civilization not with borders, but with tablets. He no longer needed to campaign. His name was carried on the wind by merchants and messengers, in songs sung by temple choirs, in the curses muttered by thieves before judgment. But even as his legacy solidified, questions lingered in the minds of those who watched him from behind the stylus and seal. Was Hammurabi truly fair? Was his code a triumph of justice, or a clever illusion meant to shape obedience through fear and faith alike? The answer, as with all things in Mesopotamia, was layered like the earth after a flood. Truth settled in silt, half hidden, half revealed. Yes, he had crafted a vision of law where the weak were not entirely ignored, where the powerful could be called to account. A builder whose careless work killed a child could be executed. A landlord who cheated a tenant might lose the land. A judge who took a bribe could be fined and expelled from the court. But punishments were not equal. A nobleman striking another noble might pay a fee, striking a commoner, a smaller one. And if a slave struck a noble, death, always death. Still, the code endured. It endured not because it was perfect, but because it gave shape to something humans had long craved: order. A sense that even in the chaos of floods, famine, and feuds, there was a structure to things. A place to go, a sentence to weigh, a verdict to pass. Hammurabi died quietly, no epic battle, no grand procession. His death was recorded in clay, noted by scribes, and followed by days of mourning. His successors would struggle to hold what he had built. The unity, once held firm by charisma and calculation, began to fray. Enemies pressed in. Temples fought over tithes. Judges once again favored gold over truth. But Hammurabi's stele remained. It stood long after his name was forgotten in the mouths of the people. It stood when his empire splintered. It stood when the Assyrians came, when the Persians came, when the Greeks came. And in the 20th century, thousands of years later, it was discovered again, buried in Susa, far from Babylon. The stone, worn but intact. The god still seated, the king still standing, and the words still legible. In those quiet, precise lines, we glimpse a moment when one man dared to shape the very idea of justice, not with fire or conquest alone, but with the final, fragile power of law. Long before the steeples of cathedrals or the spires of glass cities, the skyline of ancient Babylon was marked by something altogether different. Massive, tiered towers of sun-baked clay rising out of the river plains like stairways to the gods. These were the ziggurats, not palaces, not tombs, not dwellings. They were temples, yes, but not in the way we might imagine. They were not places filled with congregations or choirs, but vast, solemn monuments. Most were off-limits to the average Babylonian. Sacred grounds, reserved for priests, offerings, and the silent rituals of communication between the heavens and the earth. The most famous among them, Etemenanke, stood in Babylon itself, a towering structure that later inspired the biblical tale of the Tower of Babel. Its name meant the foundation of heaven and earth. It soared upward in 7 ascending terraces, each level painted in brilliant colors, catching the sun as it climbed from the eastern horizon. At the top was a small shrine, gleaming white or gold, meant to be the dwelling of the god Marduk, patron of Babylon and king of the divine realm. But what was the ziggurat truly for? To understand it, we must return to the Mesopotamian mind, a worldview deeply tied to cycles of nature, divine will, and cosmic balance. The people of Babylon believed the gods lived among them, but in their own spaces. Just as kings had palaces, so too did deities. The ziggurat was not a building to enter, but a pedestal upon which the god's presence could descend. It was a link between the mundane and the divine. Every element of its construction reflected this symbolism. The base was square, solid, earthly of the world. The levels rose upward, narrowing with each tier, echoing the climb of the stars or the path of the soul. The stairs, broad and steep, were not for mortals, but for the gods themselves, or their appointed priests. And yet, there was more to these towers than sacred geometry. They were marvels of engineering, built from mud brick and bitumen, reinforced with reeds, covered with glazed tiles that shimmered in blues and greens. Rainfall was rare, but when it came, the structures had to endure. Drainage systems were carved into the bricks. Shadows shifted around them like clockwork, casting long lines across the plazas at their feet. At dawn, the ziggurat was golden. At noon, blinding. At dusk, it became a silhouette, looming, silent, still. Imagine standing in the plaza below as the wind rolls off the river, the scent of damp clay, the distant chanting of temple priests. Above you, the tower seems impossibly high, its top lost in haze. Birds circle lazily, nesting in the ledges. The city bustles around it, but the ziggurat does not move. It waits. Even in sleep, Babylon could feel its presence. Not just a building, but a question. A monument not just to faith, but to ambition. Why build so high? Why reach toward the heavens? What was the priest doing at the summit, alone beneath the stars? These were questions that even the Babylonians asked, and the answers were always layered in silence. Though the ziggurat's broad face and towering mass announced its presence to all, its inner purpose remained cloaked in ritual and restricted space. Few outside the priesthood ever knew what took place within the uppermost shrine, or what secrets lay buried in the shadowed chambers below. Even those allowed to ascend the tower rarely climbed higher than the first few terraces. The summit, where the god Marduk was believed to descend at appointed times, was considered too sacred for daily footsteps. There, in a small cellar, offerings of food, incense, and water were left out each day. But no one ever saw Marduk consume them. No one ever heard his voice echo through the brick, and yet the offerings continued. This was not out of superstition alone, but of duty, because the ziggurat was more than just a home for the divine. It was a calendar, a clock, a cosmic map rendered in brick and shadow. The priests of Babylon were not merely religious figures. They were also astronomers, mathematicians, and archivists. From the top of the ziggurat, they studied the skies. They observed the rise of Venus, the turning of the seasons, the path of Mars as it crossed the night. On clear nights, they marked the constellations and recorded their movements in cuneiform on clay tablets, some of which have survived, still legible to this day. This celestial connection was no coincidence. The shape of the ziggurat itself, a series of rising platforms, mirrored the movement of the stars, the slow, stepwise dance from horizon to zenith. The priests believed the heavens were not chaotic, but ordered, predictable, and through this order, the will of the gods could be known. Each level of the tower was painted in symbolic colors: deep indigo for the night sky, white for purity, red for fire, and black for the underworld. The journey from the ground to the top was more than a physical ascent. It was a ritual reenactment of the soul's journey through the cosmic layers. To walk those steps was to move from the earth to the heavens, level by sacred level. And what of the hidden places? Some ziggurats, archaeologists have found, contained storage chambers, rooms sealed in silence, filled with jars of oil, bolts of linen, ceremonial tools, and statues wrapped in reed mats. Not for everyday use, but for specific rites, activated at the right moment in the sacred calendar. Others suspect more secretive uses: whispers of oracles who spoke only in the highest chamber, rumors of elite initiates kept apart from the public who fasted for days before entering the shrine. Some believe the top level was used not only for prayer, but for celestial ceremonies, rituals that aligned with eclipses, solstices, and planetary conjunctions. There is even evidence that kings would sleep there. On special occasions, the ruler might be brought to the summit alone, unarmed, wrapped in ceremonial cloth. There, in the dark stillness, he would lie beside a sacred statue of a goddess, possibly Ishtar, or a lesser consort of Marduk. No one knows what happened during those nights, whether dreams were received, whether judgments were passed. But the ritual symbolized divine union, an act meant to renew the land, the king, and the kingdom. And when the king descended at dawn, it was not merely as a man, but as one who had touched the sky, or so it was believed. For the ziggurat, in all its tiered mystery, was never meant to be just a building. It was a bridge, a theater for gods and mortals alike. And every brick carried the weight of 1,000 hopes. As centuries passed, the ziggurats aged with grace and gravity. Some cracked under the pressure of time, their foundations softened by the river's breath and the quiet tremors of the shifting earth. Others stood firm, enduring the rise and fall of kings, the reshaping of borders, and the quiet accumulation of dust. But beneath the visible surface, beneath the symmetrical tiers and ritual stairways, there were echoes, hints of forgotten uses, stories that slipped between the lines of temple records and imperial edicts. Among them were the murmured rumors of what lay within the ziggurat's belly. Beneath the lowest terrace, below the level of worship, some structures held chambers buried deep in the ground, part storehouse, part tomb, part mystery. Archaeologists have uncovered sealed vaults filled with offerings, carved figurines, sealed amphorae, bundles of reeds tied with bitumen twine. Many were marked with symbols, Not names, not words, but glyphs of celestial bodies, or the swirling impressions of a coiled snake or a bird mid-flight. Perhaps these were tokens meant to secure favor with the gods. Perhaps they were memories, interred like dreams, meant to stay untouched. One fragment of a cuneiform tablet, baked hard and unearthed centuries later, described a ceremony called the opening of the deep. It referred to a priest descending with a torch into the lower levels during the longest night of the year. There, in silence, he was said to read a prayer meant to awaken the old gods, not Marduk or Ishtar, but the older, more primal spirits of water and night, the forgotten deities buried with the silt of history. Whether this was myth, metaphor, or actual ritual, we cannot know. But it speaks to something deeply Mesopotamian, the belief that the divine was not merely above, but below, within, and all around. Some have speculated that these subterranean chambers may have served as early libraries. Clay tablets have been found in corners beneath the debris, arranged not at random, but with care. Perhaps scribes stored records there, protected from fire, from flood, and from the interference of kings. Others whisper of darker possibilities. That in times of crisis, plague, rebellion, famine, people were brought beneath the ziggurat not for safety, but for sacrifice. No definitive evidence supports this, and yet the silence of history often hides its sharpest truths. What is known is this: the ziggurat was alive, not in the way of trees or beasts, but as a vessel of meaning. It changed with the seasons. It echoed with chants. Its bricks bore the thumbprints of slaves and artisans alike, those whose names are lost, but whose work rose level by level into the sky. And beneath those bricks, in the cool shadowed depths, something waited, not sinister, not divine, but ancient, persistent. A hum, a presence, like the pressure in the air before a storm. The ziggurat was not merely a temple. It was a place where questions outlasted answers, where the weight of belief and the strangeness of time mingled in dust and silence. And long after the last prayer was offered, it remained. While the ordinary Babylonian toiled under the sun, shaping bricks, hauling water, or grinding grain until their hands were raw, another class of men moved through the city with quiet reverence and unseen power: the priests. These were the gatekeepers of the divine, the keepers of ritual, the interpreters of omens. To be a priest in Babylon was not merely to serve the gods, it was to dwell in a world apart. From a young age, a boy selected for the temple path would be removed from the rhythms of common life. He would not become a trader, a farmer, or a soldier. Instead, he entered the cloistered domain of the temple school, called the Eduba, or tablet house. There, under the watchful eyes of older priests and scribes, he would begin his transformation. The training was long and difficult. Not only did he learn to read and write cuneiform, a skill only a privileged few in all of Mesopotamia mastered, but he also studied rituals, incantations, celestial patterns, and the delicate art of sacrificial timing. Days were spent copying hymns onto clay tablets, reciting prayers until the tongue grew tired, and memorizing lists of divine names, plant properties, and dream symbols. But there were privileges too. Unlike the laborers and farmers, temple priests lived apart, inside sacred precincts called temenos. These were walled complexes surrounding the temple and its adjoining buildings. Quiet, orderly places with gardens, storehouses, dormitories, and sometimes even private baths. The priests dined on meat and dates, drank fine beer and wine, and wore clean white robes woven of imported linen. They were well fed, not because of wealth, but because of offerings. Each day, citizens brought gifts to the temple: grain, fruit, animals, incense, intended for the gods. But the gods, being invisible, did not physically consume these things. After the appropriate rituals, it was the priests who received the leftovers. And so the temple table became a place of silent bounty. Imagine it, A long, cool room of stone, shaded from the sun. Reed mats line the floor, bronze bowls shimmer with dates and roasted meat. Vessels of fermented barley beer sit in the corners, their contents dark and thick. The air smells of incense and roasted lamb. A handful of priests murmur low prayers in Sumerian, the old sacred tongue, before taking their places to eat. And always, just behind the comfort, there is a layer of gravity. A priest's life, while privileged, was also tightly bound by duty. Every act, whether eating, bathing, or speaking, was part of the sacred order. There were rules for everything. Rules about what to wear, how to walk, what to say upon waking, how to cleanse before sleep. And always, the beard. A Babylonian priest's beard was not grown carelessly. It was a symbol of sacred order, combed daily, perfumed with oil, shaped to represent not just maturity, but divine harmony. To cut it improperly or allow it to go unwashed was an offense not merely to cleanliness, but to the gods themselves. In the city's heart, the priest was both a presence and an enigma. He walked the same streets as merchants and scribes, but the space around him seemed quieter. People parted to let him pass. Even the king, adorned in gold and lapis, might consult him before a campaign. For the priest held something the rest of Babylon could not see, the thread between the world of mortals and the mysterious realm of the divine. A thread woven from silence, ritual, and the steady beating of time. And with it he lived not above the people but beside the gods. A Babylonian priest's life was measured not in hours, but in omens, offerings, and sacred repetitions. From the moment he rose before the city stirred, to the hush of nightfall, when the gods were honored in flame and shadow, his every movement was part of a tightly woven pattern, one that had not changed for generations. Each day began with purification. The priest would rise before dawn and bathe in cold water drawn from a sacred source, often a temple cistern or designated channel from the river. It wasn't merely about cleanliness. Water, in Mesopotamian belief, was the domain of the god Enki, lord of wisdom and deep things. To bathe was to symbolically re-enter the primeval waters, to be reborn into the light of ritual purpose. After the bath came the donning of garments, clean linen robes, always white, always unadorned. Jewelry was forbidden, sandals were simple or absent entirely. Silence was expected during this process. The act of dressing was a prayer in itself, a silent acknowledgement that the priest was not preparing to act as himself, but as a vessel through which the gods could be served. At the temple, incense was lit. The heavy scent of myrrh, cedar resin, and frankincense drifted through the sanctuaries and outer courts, curling around carved statues and clay altars. The smell was thick, sacred, and unmistakable, a kind of divine signature. The priest believed that this smoke rose to the heavens, carrying with it the day's first words of praise. Rituals followed in strict sequence. Each temple had its own schedule, but in the great temples of Babylon, especially the Asagila, home to Marduk, priests performed daily offerings with measured grace. Food and drink were brought forth, bowls of barley, dates, cuts of roasted lamb, jugs of beer or milk. The gods, represented in carefully maintained statues, were presented these meals ceremonially. A priest might approach the statue of Marduk in complete silence, eyes lowered, and place the offering before him on a golden stand. He would whisper a hymn, not improvised but memorized and recited with precision. Every syllable mattered. Every motion was choreographed by centuries of tradition. Nothing was casual in the presence of a god. After the offerings, omens were read. This was one of the priest's most important and most feared duties. Omens could come from many places: the liver of a sacrificed lamb, the pattern of oil on water, the flight of birds, or the shape of a dream. Priests trained in divination were called baru, and their interpretations could affect the course of an entire kingdom. If an eclipse was seen the night before, or a goat was born with a twisted leg, it might signal war, famine, or the displeasure of a specific deity. Kings often consulted the Baru before battle or public works. If the omens were bad, the plans would change. Sometimes substitute rituals were held to divert the gods' wrath. Stand-in kings were crowned for a day and ritually removed. It was a world of signs and shadows, where every flicker of the stars could echo down into daily life. Between ceremonies, priests copied texts. This work, often slow and solitary, was essential. The temple's scribes recorded not only ritual formulas and hymns, but economic transactions, temple inventories, and medical incantations. It was in these quiet hours, alone with stylus and clay, that Babylon's vast knowledge was preserved. Without the priesthood, the libraries of the ancient world would never have existed. And so the priest moved through his day not in haste, but with weight. Every gesture bore meaning, every word was ancient. Every action, whether bathing, chanting, or simply sitting in stillness, was connected to something far larger than the self. To the outside world, priests may have seemed serene, even aloof. But within, they bore the tremendous burden of upholding balance between chaos and order, people and gods, silence and sound. And in the stillness of their duties, they held Babylon's sacred heart. A Babylonian priest's life was measured not in hours, but in omens, offerings, and sacred repetitions. From the moment he rose before the city stirred, to the hush of nightfall, when the gods were honored in flame and shadow, his every movement was part of a tightly woven pattern, one that had not changed for generations. Each day began with purification. The priest would rise before dawn and bathe in cold water drawn from a sacred source, often a temple cistern or designated channel from the river. It wasn't merely about cleanliness. Water, in Mesopotamian belief, was the domain of the god Enki, lord of wisdom and deep things. To bathe was to symbolically re-enter the primeval waters, to be reborn into the light of ritual purpose. After the bath came the donning of garments, clean linen robes, always white, always unadorned. Jewelry was forbidden, sandals were simple or absent entirely. Silence was expected during this process. The act of dressing was a prayer in itself, a silent acknowledgement that the priest was not preparing to act as himself, but as a vessel through which the gods could be served. At the temple, incense was lit. The heavy scent of myrrh, cedar resin, and frankincense drifted through the sanctuaries and outer courts, curling around carved statues and clay altars. The smell was thick, sacred, and unmistakable, a kind of divine signature. The priest believed that this smoke rose to the heavens, carrying with it the day's first words of praise. Rituals followed in strict sequence. Each temple had its own schedule, but in the great temples of Babylon, especially the Asagila, home to Marduk, priests performed daily offerings with measured grace. Food and drink were brought forth, bowls of barley, dates, cuts of roasted lamb, jugs of beer or milk. The gods, represented in carefully maintained statues, were presented these meals ceremonially. A priest might approach the statue of Marduk in complete silence, eyes lowered, and place the offering before him on a golden stand. He would whisper a hymn, not improvised but memorized and recited with precision. Every syllable mattered. Every motion was choreographed by centuries of tradition. Nothing was casual in the presence of a god. After the offerings, omens were read. This was one of the priest's most important and most feared duties. Omens could come from many places: the liver of a sacrificed lamb, the pattern of oil on water, the flight of birds, or the shape of a dream. Priests trained in divination were called Baru, and their interpretations could affect the course of an entire kingdom. If an eclipse was seen the night before, or a goat was born with a twisted leg, it might signal war, famine, or the displeasure of a specific deity. Kings often consulted the Baru before battle or public works. If the omens were bad, the plans would change. Sometimes substitute rituals were held to divert the gods' wrath. Stand-in kings were crowned for a day and ritually removed. It was a world of signs and shadows, where every flicker of the stars could echo down into daily life. Between ceremonies, priests copied texts. This work, often slow and solitary, was essential. The temple's scribes recorded not only ritual formulas and hymns, but economic transactions, temple inventories, and medical incantations. It was in these quiet hours, alone with stylus and clay, that Babylon's vast knowledge was preserved. Without the priesthood, the libraries of the ancient world would never have existed. And so the priest moved through his day not in haste, but with weight. Every gesture bore meaning, every word was ancient. Every action, whether bathing, chanting, or simply sitting in stillness, was connected to something far larger than the self. To the outside world, priests may have seemed serene, even aloof. But within, they bore the tremendous burden of upholding balance between chaos and order, people and gods, silence and sound. And in the stillness of their duties, they held Babylon's sacred heart. As centuries turned and new empires swept across Mesopotamia, the old gods of Babylon remained in their sanctuaries, waiting, watching, remembered in smoke and chant. But even gods can grow quiet in the face of time. And with each shifting empire, the power of Babylon's temples began to dim. The Persian conquest brought tolerance, yes, but also reorganization. The temples continued, but their independence was eroded. Darius and his successors allowed the rites to proceed, yet they folded the priesthoods into a broader imperial bureaucracy. Offerings became smaller, land grants less frequent. The sacred authority of the priests was preserved on the surface, but their true influence began to recede. Then came the Greeks. Alexander's arrival in Babylon was met with incense and ceremony. The priests, always attuned to shifting tides, welcomed him as a new king under old traditions. He, in turn, paid respect to Marduk, even planning to restore the great ziggurat. But his death came too soon, and with it uncertainty. The Seleucids who followed built in the Hellenistic style. They brought their own gods, their own temples, their own ways of speaking to the divine. Babylon remained important, but less so. Slowly, the rhythms of daily temple life began to falter. Students in the tablet house dwindled. Hymns were forgotten, rituals simplified. And then Rome. By the time Rome had reached the edges of the east, Babylon was already a shadow. The river had shifted again. The canals were choked with silt. The ziggurat had become a mound of eroded brick. The priests, those last few who still remembered the old words, walked their rounds like ghosts through crumbling courtyards. A final tablet records a complaint. A priest, writing in trembling Akkadian, notes the theft of temple goats. The writing is clumsy, the stylus unsteady, the lines uneven, and then no more. Silence. And yet the memory lingers. In today's museums, those white-robed priests still live on in carved reliefs and wedge-marked clay tablets. We see them in profile, pouring libations, holding offerings, their beards curled with care. We hear their voices in the fragments of incantations, in the careful lists of omens, in the weary inventories of temple stores. We do not know their names, but we know their rhythms. We know that at dawn they rose to bathe and chant, that they touched the cool stone of altars long vanished, that they read the stars with a kind of reverence now lost to modern skies, that they walked barefoot not because they had to, but because the divine was never to be approached in pride. In a way, they succeeded. The Babylonian priest did not merely serve the gods. He preserved something older, something still flickering in the dust. The belief that the world was more than what could be seen, that each day held meaning, and that silence, when practiced with care, could become a kind of prayer. And now, long after their temples have crumbled and their languages have died, The echo of their footsteps still lingers, soft and slow, along the forgotten stone corridors of Babylon. And so we come to the end of our descent into ancient Babylon, a world of brick and bitumen, gods and grain, silence and ceremony. We have followed the clay-streaked footsteps of the laborer, crushed beneath sun and debt, and the strategic march of Hammurabi, lawgiver and unifier, whose words still survive in stone. We have climbed the sacred tiers of the ziggurat, not only in history but in imagination, tracing the mystery of a structure that once dared to rise toward the stars. And finally, we walked in the soft, measured steps of the Babylonian priest, keeper of time, guardian of ritual, and quiet servant of forgotten gods. Babylon was a city of opposites, harsh and holy, cruel and brilliant. Its rivers could bring life or drown it, its bricks could build homes or prisons, and within its walls, beneath layers of bureaucracy and belief, there lived real people, sweating, dreaming, fearing and hoping just as we do now. Thank you for letting this old city speak once more. Now let the echoes fade. Let the canals still. Let the stars return to their quiet orbits overhead. This is the end of the full script. Rest well.